led. Politics needs an update. We demand a people's house. We demand a people's house. We are in crisis. We are in crisis. Our whole future is definitely.
But there's no doubt in my mind, looking at the data that we face, that the UK is experiencing a sizable economic shock in the wake of the referendum. Any reduction...
The Hidden Aid Report, what Starmer doesn't want you to know. Right. Before we dive into what might be the most significant government cover-up since the expenses scandal, smash that subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you view Keir Starmer's Labour government and their approach to international aid. Trust me, you'll want to be subscribed for what's coming next. Picture this. You commission a comprehensive review from one of Britain's most distinguished economists, someone who's held the top positions at the Bank of England, the World Bank, and Columbia University. You promise the public they'll see the findings. Then, when the report lands on your desk, you bury it so deep it might as well be in the Mariana Trench. Welcome to the Starmer administration's latest transparency disaster, and it involves a report that could expose exactly why Britain's aid cuts are even more devastating than we thought.
It's certainly helping the economy to find a new equilibrium, and the flexible nature of the UK economy will ultimately adjust to its new circumstances. But the process of adjustment can be painful, and that's where monetary policy can help. And it seems to me likely that further monetary stimulus will be required at some point in order to help ensure that a slowdown in economic activity doesn't turn into something more pernicious. However, the likely time...
Baroness Minouche isn't just any advisor. She's a heavyweight in international economics. Former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, former Vice President of the World Bank, former President of Columbia University in New York. When Labour tasked her in September last year to review how Britain could maximize international development in our rapidly changing world, they knew they were getting serious expertise. What they apparently didn't anticipate was getting recommendations they'd rather the British public never see. The timing here is absolutely crucial, and if you're not already subscribed, do it now, because the timeline of this story is about to get very interesting indeed. Sharfik completes a months-long review and delivers a finding to ministers in February. Just days later, Starmer announces his slashing aid spending by billions to fund a larger defense budget. Coincidence? I think not. Let's talk numbers, because they are staggering. Aid spending dropped from 0.5% of gross national income to just 0.3%. To put that in perspective, the previous Conservative government had already cut the target from 0.7% during COVID, promising to restore it by 2027. Labour has now made those cuts even deeper and seemingly permanent. We're talking about billions of pounds that won't reach the world's most vulnerable populations, and there's a report sitting in government files that might explain exactly why this is a catastrophic mistake. The government's response to requests for this report reads like a masterclass in bureaucratic stonewalling. When the Financial Times first requested the Sharfik report through Freedom of Information laws in March, the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office did what any transparent government would do. They delayed their response for a month, not once, not twice, but 3 consecutive times. By June 11th, the day of the government spending review no less, they finally replied that they were unable to disclose a document. Their reasoning: the public interest in keeping government policy development behind closed doors outweighed the public interest in actually knowing what their government is doing. Hit that subscribe button if you want to stay informed about these kinds of government accountability issues, because what happens next is even more revealing about how this administration operates. The FCDO claimed the public interest in maintaining confidential policy development trumped transparency. But here's the kicker. The government had explicitly promised last year to communicate a summary of the review findings upon their conclusion. When pressed on Wednesday, officials suddenly claimed they never intended to publish the report at all. The audacity is breathtaking, isn't it? Promise transparency, commission expensive reviews, then claim you never meant to share the results when they become politically inconvenient. Sarah Champion, the Labour chair of the International Development Select Committee, isn't buying it, and frankly, neither should you. She's called the situation quite unfortunate, stating that Sharfik's recommendations are essential for restoring Britain's international standing and establishing effective foreign aid policy. Champion argues that Shafiq's recent appointment as the Prime Minister's economic advisor makes this the perfect moment to finally reveal what her report actually says. The Liberal Democrats aren't pulling any punches either. Monica Harding, their international development spokesperson, has accused ministers of actively burying the report while turning their backs on the most vulnerable people globally. She's spot on when she suggests that ministers would rather brush their manifesto promises about restoring the aid budget under the rug than deal with the consequences of their policy choices. Make sure you're subscribed because the international implications of this story are about to get even more serious. The timing of these aid cuts couldn't be worse. With Donald Trump slashing the U.S. aid budget, Britain's cuts are compounding global humanitarian challenges. The government's own impact analysis admits that these cuts will increase the risk of disease and death in African nations, yet they are sitting on a report that might explain alternative approaches or highlight the full consequences of their decisions. Government officials claim Shafiq's report was only meant to inform internal FCDO policy and contributed to recent reforms aligning the agency with government priorities. But Gideon Rabinowitz from Bond, the umbrella organization for aid agencies, calls this nonsense. He argues it's vital for transparency that the public sees this report, especially given what he describes as the most radical shake-up of the UK aid program in a generation. Rabinowitz makes a compelling point about democratic accountability. How can the public understand the government's reasoning and objective behind these massive reforms without seeing the expert analysis that supposedly informed them? How can parliamentarians hold the government accountable for policies affecting global development issues that impact everyone, including British interests abroad, without access to the foundational research? The government has prioritized spending through the World Bank's development arm and other multilateral institutions, but their own impact assessment reveals potential harm to bilateral programs in countries including Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Ethiopia. These aren't abstract policy decisions. They are choices that will directly affect millions of lives and Britain's diplomatic relationships across Africa and beyond. Subscribe now because here's where this story connects to broader patterns in the Starmer government's approach to transparency and accountability. This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a concerning trend where Labour promises openness during campaigns but practices opacity in government. The hypocrisy is particularly galling when you consider Labour's opposition rhetoric about conservative secrecy and lack of transparency. They've inherited the same institutional instincts toward concealment that they once criticized. The excuse that releasing expert analysis might compromise future policy development is the same justification used by previous administrations to avoid scrutiny. These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They are practical challenges affecting real policies and real lives. The Shafiq report controversy suggests the Starmer government prioritizes political convenience over democratic accountability and expert analysis over transparent debate. Subscribe if you want to understand how these issues connect to Britain's changing role in the world. Our international development programs have been a crucial element of British soft power and global influence. The cuts to aid spending, combined with secrecy about the analysis behind them, signal a retreat from international leadership and humanitarian commitment. This retreat comes at precisely the moment when global challenges require increased cooperation and shared responsibility. Climate change, pandemic preparedness, migration pressures, and technological disruption all demand international coordination and collective action. Britain's aid cuts and lack of transparency about the reasoning behind them undermine our capacity to lead on these issues. The story of the hidden Shafiq report ultimately reflects the broader challenge of maintaining democratic accountability in complex policy environments. Modern governments commission extensive analysis from world-class experts, but then claim that sharing this research would compromise their ability to govern effectively. This argument fundamentally misunderstands democratic governance. Transparency about expert analysis strengthens policymaking by enabling informed debate, identifying potential problems, and building public support for necessary but difficult decisions. Secrecy weakens policymaking by preventing scrutiny, hiding mistakes, and undermining public trust. Make sure you're subscribed because this is exactly the kind of story that requires sustained attention and analysis. Government transparency battles often fade from media attention when other crises emerge, but the principles at stake remain crucial for democratic accountability and effective governance. The Starmer government's handling of the Shafiq report will set important precedents for how future administrations balance expert advice, democratic scrutiny, and political management. Their current approach prioritizes short-term political convenience over long-term institutional health and democratic legitimacy. Parliamentary pressure for transparency might eventually succeed, but the government's initial response reveals concerning instinct towards secrecy and unaccountability. These instincts won't disappear with resolution of this particular controversy. They'll influence how Labour handles future expert analysis and public accountability challenges. The international implications will also persist regardless of whether the report is eventually published. Britain's aid cuts have already damaged relationships and reduced our global influence. The secrecy surrounding the analysis behind these cuts compound concerns about British reliability and commitment to international cooperation. Partner countries and multilateral organizations are drawing their own conclusions about British priorities and values based on our actions rather than our rhetoric. The gap between Labour's campaign promises about restoring Britain's international standing and their governing decisions about aid cuts and transparency will have lasting consequences for our global relationships. So there you have it. The story of a report that might explain one of the most significant shifts in British foreign policy in decades, hidden away because its findings apparently conflict with political expedience. A distinguished economist's comprehensive analysis of international development effectiveness, commissioned with public money, promised to be shared with the public, then buried when it became inconvenient for government messaging. This isn't just about international aid, though the human consequences of these cuts will be devastating for millions of vulnerable people worldwide. It's about whether British democracy can maintain meaningful accountability when governments prefer secrecy to scrutiny, political management to democratic debate, and expedience to expertise. The Starmer administration came to power promising change, transparency, and restored international standing. Their handling of the Sharfik report reveals the gap between those promises and governing realities. Subscribe now because we'll be watching closely to see whether they can bridge that gap or whether this pattern of secrecy and unaccountability becomes a new normal for British politics. The stakes couldn't be higher for both democratic governance and Britain's role in the world.